Hi, I'm Robert Perry. I'm running for U.S. House of Representatives for District 2, Kentucky, and I'm here tonight with Oops, She Didn't Show Up. I met Oops, She Didn't Show Up at a Take Back Kentucky meeting, and I was really excited to hear her talk about open records request. She was really passionate about that. She was really passionate about how she was using it. And I thought, wow, libertarians are really about transparency. This is a tool we should totally be using. I'm sure we do sometimes, but I don't hear enough about it. And I wanted to invite, oops, she didn't show up here tonight, so she could teach us more about her battles with it, how she got into it, maybe some of the war stories, what it's good for, what it's not good for, kind of get us started with it. But unfortunately, she didn't show up. So I'm going to just ad hoc something real quick, just because a few people do kind of tune in nightly, and I don't want to break that pattern. I thought I would just briefly talk about the police violence and the response to it. That's something I've tried talking about with David Patterson. It's something I've been passionate about talking about since 2014. Essentially, my take on it is it's deeper than what it's usually blamed on. It's frequently blamed on a few bad eggs, bad training, racism. I want to discuss the last one first. The reason I don't buy the racism. Oh, there she is. But let me finish what I was saying, and we'll pivot back to her. The reason I don't believe the racism argument is because my sister used to be a nurse. And one of the things that made me paranoid about law enforcement really early on was she worked in ER. And she would tell me about some of the damage that would be done to some of the people that police officers were apprehending. Sorry, you're going to have to follow this, Adrienne, but I was improving. Some of the damage done by officers. And this was in a very rural county in Kentucky. The people in question weren't Black. So this isn't a urban versus rural thing. This isn't a Black versus white thing. Don't get me wrong, it exacerbates it. And even some of what I perceive as the underlying problems, I think, exacerbate it. In my opinion, the underlying problems is we simply have too many laws that put law enforcement at odds with the general consensus of the population. We have too many laws that people see and think of as immoral laws. And when we have law enforcement enforcing those laws, we don't think of it as good moral things. And thus we don't think of them as good moral people. We have law enforcement raising funds via overly zealous enforcement of speed limits. We're not talking about people driving reckless. We're talking about people driving a little fast, maybe on an empty road or something like that, or sometimes just when traffic's moving fast. I mean, honestly, sometimes driving the speed limit is the most dangerous thing you can do. And, the reason I bring this up is when we let the state, when we let our local cities, when we let them act that way, when we let them direct law enforcement to go after those things, to go after the things that put them at conflict with the community, you're going to have rising tensions. You're going to have growing distrust. And I know you watch these videos and you think that's an oversimplification, but I don't think it is. If you build distrust, hatred, in general tension between two groups of people, when they have to come together to interact in some ways, it is far less likely to go well. I would probably babble on that for about 45 minutes, but oh, she didn't show up, showed up. So she's backstage now. So we'll pivot to that because that's what I labeled this as. And I think we'll learn a lot from her.
Hi
Adrienne,
there. How are
I
you?
don't hear you.
Oh, you
There
don't?
we. I'm
Okay.
good. I do. I do now. I'm good. Other than I was not all that prepared to improv and just completely riffing. How'd I do?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
No, now I can. What did you say?
I said, how'd I do? Could you hear me
Oh,
before?
yeah, I could hear you. Yeah, you did great.
Okay. Okay, great.
I mean, it is a news item, so I was actually just having a conversation about this just a couple hours ago.
Right, right. Well, I helped David Patterson with his campaign in 2014, and I didn't go into all of it just then, but I never really got into trouble with law enforcement. I'm a sadly well-behaved libertarian. um, but just I observed a lot of things in my youth, and I just had a general mistrust for law enforcement. And then all of a sudden, I was helping a law enforcement officer with his run for Senate and working with him on a daily basis. And he really did a lot to bridge the gap. So, David, I know I've told you before, but once again, thank you for that, sir. And to recap what I was just trying to say, I think we all need to work to get law enforcement focused on enforcing laws that we feel good about law enforcement enforcing as a society. And I think at least in some way, I think in a big way, but I hope we can agree that at least in some way that would help reduce tension. But that's not what we're talking about tonight. Tonight we're talking about I met Adrienne at Take Back Kentucky, and I was really excited because libertarians love transparency. Now it's funny, we love privacy. Privacy's for us. Privacy's for the citizens. Uh, Government doesn't get privacy. We own them. They get transparency, whether they like it or not. And that's what I got really excited about when I was listening to Adrienne. Is she was making sure they got it. Now Adrienne's not new to Frankfurt. I know she looks young, but she's got some experience under her belt. You want to tell us a little about that, Adrienne?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
really, all started back in 2009. Well, that's not really how it started, but that's the first year I went to the Capitol. Um, because, the bills that they pass up there, a lot of people have no idea what they really do. About 5 things are talked about in the media, maybe 10, even a really good year. But there really are about 500 different topics and 1,500 different pieces of legislation in a given year. And when I say year, I really mean about 2 months space of time.
Oh, wow.
Session really is only, January through March or April. So there's a lot going on. And I saw a few things and I wanted to go check it out and have a say and keep elected officials accountable. And that's what I did. And it was amazing because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, okay, if there's something bad in the bill, let's stop the bill. And if
Right.
something needs to be done, let's pass it. So
Cool.
that's what I did. Starting in 2009, I started just going to the Capitol, talking to legislators, speaking in committees, doing my research. I started reading the bills, going through every bill every year in the legislative session.
No, wait, you just show up and start talking to them about bills?
Yep, pretty much.
Cool.
Yeah, kind of a nerd, but anyway, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So those people who are doing that are obviously very few, although you do know about this already because we call them lobbyists. They are paid people that have a certain interest in, a paid interest for it as a company or whatever like that. I was literally a concerned citizen speaking on behalf of the people. And one of my favorite stories is the very first year, the first second bill I ever spoke on. The first one I ever just randomly unplanned walked into, really. The senators are up there having a conversation, and one of them says, well, what do you think the people are going to say whenever they find out that, we're going to add these new fees? And that question had never gotten answered. And by the time I got up to speak, I was like, well, let me tell you what the people are going to say. No. So anyway, those are the kind of things that I just started on. Eventually, of course, as you well are aware, or maybe you're not, but anyway, in 2013, the founder of Take Back Kentucky had passed away. They asked me to take over as the statewide leader, which I did. And in the process, ended up traveling the state, meeting with people and with legislators, training people in the legislative process, and educating legislators on the issues that they usually aren't hearing about, whether it's topics they aren't hearing about or information about the topics they are hearing about, but the details that they are not hearing about. So that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot and saw some good progress. And so that's kind of the background that I had coming into the lieutenant governor's office. In fact, Janine Hampton was one of the people I trained back when I was traveling the state. And she was, and so come to find out, she gets elected as lieutenant governor, and I get the phone call, hey, who knows state policy? So I did serve in the executive branch in her office for that term, and that's really where you really see a lot more stuff. The legislature deals with the agencies on a more policy, an idealistic view. We try to get information on how things work, but we really don't actually see how they work usually. And you're making it based on third-hand information. Executive branch, when you're working in there a daily basis, you can see a lot of things firsthand that's turn on a lot of light bulbs. Oh, that's what was going on. Or that's what we really need to clean up, and what legislators are even aware of this. So obviously brought me to about where we are now.
Are legislatures ever interested in bridging that gap? Is there things they can do to get more connected to the actual facts on the ground? Do you see that?
Well, there are sometimes they'll take a tour of a certain thing or whatever. I've been on tours. Let me tell you about the VIP tours. Now it depends on agency by agency. I've been on a VIP tour before that was not a VIP tour. It was literally, we're in a prison dorm. The guys didn't know we were coming. Okay. And then I've been on a VIP tour.
That sounds like an important tour.
Well, exactly. I mean, I kind of already knew how it was, but it was, that was the kind of tour. There's three of us, and we saw the real deal. And there was a VIP tour that they arranged for everybody to be able to see everything. But I can tell you right now, we didn't see anything. In fact, I started asking too many questions, apparently, because I started getting mixed answers on what was really going on. And I come to find out later what really went on. And that was they hid all the inmates. They didn't want us to see anything. That's the VIP tour they take people on. So, do they have the opportunities? There are a few little opportunities to see stuff, but when you see it, snippets, you know how it is. It's edited. It's paired. It's not a daily grind of an office, hearing people behind the scenes saying, oh, good, the legislators have left town now, we can get back to work. Let's undo everything they've done. Those conversations, I'm not sure those are really shared.
Yeah, it's funny. There's a similar challenge actually in my industry, software, because so often you have sort of like project owners. You have people who specialize in telling the coders what they should code, and they like to keep themselves inserted between the coders and the users. And there's a lot of occasions that you can have profound benefit by just sort of stepping around them and spending a day or two with the user, just see what they're really facing. That's not really a secret. I mean, pretty much any software developer worth their salt knows that. But it's a recurring theme. You've got to get in the trenches to know what's going on. You hear that from military commanders. You can read Call Sign Chaos. You can read that Mattis was always interested in being out there with the young men. That's kind of what he viewed his role to be. So that's definitely a recurring theme. But I'm getting a little off topic. Somewhere along the lines, you got really passionate about dragging things out into sunlight, which is what this is about. You got passionate about transparency. How did that happen?
I think it maybe started even before the whole 2009 scenario I just told you about. In 2007, actually, I read my very first bill because I was working. I was kind of helping my sister on a homework thing. I had to get on the legislative website, and on the legislative website, you'll see all of the numbers of the bills as the links. Now, nowadays, they have the new website, and it's actually can be more organized than that. Back then, you click on bills, and the first thing you see is this mass list of number links. So you have no idea what you're clicking on. You just like close your eyes, click on it, right? And so I clicked on something, and I was shocked. What I saw was that they wanted to allow IRS agents to be peace officers in Kentucky. Officers statewide. That is any type of police power you can imagine, hand it to IRS agents.
Who's they, first of all?
Well, this was the bill. So
the bill.
And Kentucky has a list of 9 or 10 different federal agencies that we do allow in the door without necessarily having approval ahead of time or whatever for Commonwealth purposes. And they want to expand this list. And they're always having these bills. At the time, they were always having them. They don't have them anymore because of what happened in 2009. But in 2007, when I first saw this, I was shocked because at that time, remember, this is pre-Obama. Now, everybody hated the IRS because they didn't like to pay their taxes. But not very many hated the IRS because they knew people who had actually been totally harassed and debilitated by the IRS. And I knew a lot more about the IRS than most people did. And I knew that was the worst idea you could ever come up with in your life. Now, a few years later, it came out a little bit more how, the IRS was simply a weapon against, let's say, the conservative people that had donated to causes that were politically incorrect, those type of things. But of course, that wasn't common knowledge in 2007.
Right. Now, I do want to step in a bit because that's not just unique to the Democrats. That goes back for decades.
Yeah.
Back and forth.
It didn't just start, but it kind of became more of a household conversation at that point, I felt like. And so
abuse tends to escalate, boys and girls.
Yes. So the transparency part of it is exposing that type of stuff. You see these things and what can you say about them because who's going to believe you? But having had a front seat to some of this stuff, it's like I've got to say something. And so I had to say something. And so in 2009, when some of these bills came back up, it wasn't IRS, but it was 3 other different agencies they wanted to do in 2009. I blew in there and actually killed the whole thing. And we've not had that same similar or whatever thing actually brought forward ever since. Because the Kentucky Constitution and the Kentucky laws need to be upheld and handled by Kentucky peace officers. We can't hand stuff away to the federal government. So, luckily, almost magically, we got that taken care of that day, really, in that committee. But, showing the light actually makes so much change whenever people don't actually know those things. So, kind of became my thing. Everything that was going on in the legislature, I felt like the legislators either don't know or people aren't bringing it out. So I started exposing more and more stuff. There's a lot of places. You don't have to look far to find either corruption, cover up, misconstruction of information, disinformation, whatever. And it kind of escalated to the point where, let's say, when I was in the executive branch, like I said, I saw a lot more stuff at a lot more levels, a lot thicker. So one of the big things, I guess, I can bring you all the way up to present. It's the most recent open records request I've done, for example. was of the Kentucky State Police. A couple of
Oh,
weeks ago, we had at the Capitol building, I walked in there every day, but all of a sudden there was this gigantic screening process. They wanted to scan your picture, your driver's license, take all of your information, figure out where you were going and log it in, which is an open meetings violation. If you're going to an open meeting, you have the right to anonymity. And
ah,
like we had a major issue. So I started digging into it. And the way that you dig into things is you start requesting records that would relate to those things. And
mm-hmm.
records requests, they came up with pretty much nothing. Nobody seemed to know how this thing got started. I had heard tinges of information that changes were coming, but I never heard when they came. They didn't come on the schedule, I was told, and they showed up overnight. And then for literally not because I was working on it constantly. It was one of those things you work on it a little bit, then you're like, well, I'm just stuck. I don't know where to go next. And then you think of something else later. So it's probably a year.
Also like my career, by the way.
It was probably about a year that it took before I actually finally got some answers. I'm not even sure we still have answers because this was my most recent open records request. Finally landed at KSP. And I said, all right, I need information on this equipment. Where did it come from? How did it get here? And they came back to me and said, well, first of all, let me add something. The open records law requires that within 3 days, they make a response.
Mm-hmm.
And identify, there's several things. You identify if they don't have the records, they got to direct you to who does. If they do have the records, they need to give them. If there's a reason that's a legal reason, there's 3 or 4 reasons why they might not have records. Let's say if they're in the archives or whatever, they have to take more time. They have to let you know how long it's going to take, give you a date certain that you can get the records, all that kind of stuff.
But somebody somewhere is going to know why equipment was bought.
Well, you would think. Here's preliminarily, though, and a lot of agencies do this. The 3 rule means actually about 6 days. So they take 3 days to think about responding, and then they take 3 days to actually respond. So that's the thing we need to clean up anyway. But moving forward on this story.
Well, the first week and a half, we were just struggling with the envelope, and there were paper cuts. It was horrible.
Well, that would be a good excuse, except for they have electronic reception of these requests.
Well,
doesn't work. Anyway, I make the request. They come back with the response finally, and they say, we don't even know if we have records. And if we do have them, we don't know where they are. But if we know where they are, we can't get to them. Then a month.
yeah.
And so I didn't even appeal at that point. I thought, I'm going to see where this goes. Because, first of all, there's a lot of problems with that statement. But let's just see how this goes. So we saw how it went. A month comes and goes. They told me, March 2nd, you will have an answer.
Oh, that's good to hear.
All right, March 2nd came and went. Did I hear anything? No, it was beginning of April. I finally heard from them. Oh, what do you know? No, like apology, no, we're a month late. No, nothing. It was just like, by the way, here's some records. And they threw them at me and handed me an invoice.
Okay.
Okay, so I got a few records on this. I still really don't know how this thing came to be. There's very little documentation on it. Who knows if we have all of it or not? But 2 months? No, the end of January is when I made the request. We're talking about the beginning of April. So yeah, a little over 2 months it took for me to get 44 pages of information, 30 some of which was all one document that had nothing to do with anything. What is going on? I know what's going on. It's the same thing I saw so many times. Agencies get requests. Well, we don't want to have to deal with them. We'll just put them on a 2-week delay because we can. Why? When I got a request for an open record in my office, I knew the 3-day rule, and I felt like unless it is, dire emergency and there's absolutely zero way you can fulfill in 3 days, my reading of the law is you have to fulfill it within 3 days. So if it's possible, I fulfilled it within 3 days. And if it literally was not possible, like somebody's out sick and somebody else is on vacation and they have records and I know they have records, but I can't get to the records and no one else can get to the records and we can't get them to get to the,
right.
We have 3 extra days to get them, back to the office or something like that. But
well, I imagine I mean, sure, some people are going to just get upset because they're going to get upset. But I would imagine if you correspond back to the person requesting and explain to them somebody's on vacation, I mean, that's a lot
Well,
different than we don't even know if we have records. It's like somebody
yes.
paid for it. How do you not know if you do not have any accounting? Do you know books? You just, money's just laying around. They bought it with drug money.
Exactly. If money walked out the door, you should have records on it. Speaking of vacation, though, and this is a bad example, there's another request that I'm fairly well known for, which the lady that does open records requests is like, apparently they only have one person for a set of offices that has thousands of employees. And so you can imagine the number and scope of open records requests this lady may handle. Okay. Apparently she's out on vacation or something. I don't even know. Their excuse was that the open records person's on vacation, therefore they're not taking any open records requests. Now, I understand if there's only one person who has the records and they can't get into their computer and or they don't know where they are and they can't get a hold of them because they're out of the country or something really dire. But I mean, the lady, of course, she should have vacation hours. I mean, it's part of our laws. We get sick time, we get vacation time, just like other employees get. You can't have
that is not like my career, but okay.
Okay. You can't have one person be the only person that can't even look at an open records request so that when they are on vacation, the law goes on hold.
Right.
And the attorney general slammed that to the ground and said, "Are you kidding me?" Because it was literally, again, the 5 or 6 day rule before they even responded to me in the first place, not within 3 days. And then they said, "Why don't you come to our office between 9 and noon on Monday?" Are you kidding me? I'm working. I mean, what? And so,
Right.
of course, that's totally illegal. And then by the time I did show up, of course, they have the option, if it's just, less than 5 megabytes, we can just email it to you. Well, guess what? At the end of this whole thing, 2 weeks, I go waiting. I finally happen into their office one day and say, "I'm just going to ask if they have the records because this is getting ridiculous." 2 pages. They handed me 2 sheets of paper. All of that for 2 sheets of paper. What in the going on? And so, we've been in meetings before. We just saw a statement come out recently about, the administration is saying that they don't want people to, make things available on open records. I'm just going to take a gamble and say every administration has always said that. The law says, we know it's going to cause public embarrassment, but we think that you need to provide the records anyway. And the legislators have said that.
This is the Andy administration that doesn't want open records?
That's the one that's come out recently, but I can about tell you from what I know, it's probably in every administration problem.
Oh, sure. But we have a lot going on. I mean, there's a lot of really legitimate questions for people to ask right now, but we'll loop back to that later. Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm just pointing out that, there are very few instances in which people really can't get records, and those are clearly delineated in the law, but they try to use a lot of gray space. And the real problem that I have is that there's not much enforcement on if an open records request is denied, not properly done, or whatever. It's more things going through the cracks than it is actually getting caught in an enforcement pattern. And if you could actually enforce the Open Records Act more strongly, I think the agencies would maybe need to get it together a little better.
Absolutely. So if somebody wants to study the nuts and bolts of it, this is the Open Records Act. Is that right?
Yes. So it's KRS Chapter 61. It's the last half of the 800s. So if you're going to the legislative website, legislature.ky.gov, there is an option on there. You can choose to look at Kentucky law. Then, of course, there's the Constitution, there's the statutes, and there are the regulations. So you go to the statutes. I always look by title because, to me, the search engine I don't understand how the search engine works on this thing. Okay. So anyway, it's just like going through an index of a book. You can just scroll down to Chapter 61. Then you just scroll down. It's actually labeled Open Records Act. There's about 10 sections or so in there. And it goes through each piece. So some of the highlights, you've got 3 days they have to respond. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, like you said, they have to supposedly respond and say, like you just said, let's start a dialogue and say, hey, look, we have a problem, or
Mm-hmm.
clarification, or something like that. Not just bounce it back and say, sorry, we don't have anything. And then you just have to resubmit a request and hope you reword it right. I mean, that's not
Right.
service. It's not public service. It's not anything good. So, um, you have 3 days to get a response. Um, you can be put off for very legitimate reasons. Unfortunately, those get stretched too much, in my opinion.
What are the legitimate reasons, though?
The
I mean,
legitimate reasons,
mm-hmm.
for example, I did an open records request about some information that was approximately 10 years old. And
Mm-hmm.
at that time, we had gone through, a few different terms, and it had gone to the archives. Now, if you've ever been to the archives, I have no idea how those people do it, because literally when you're at the end of a term, or if you're even in the middle of a term, you just have stuff that, a records retention, there's different rules for different things. So some things get kept in perpetuity. For example, the governor's calendar gets kept in perpetuity. Now, currently, we have a lot of digital records. So the digital people handle that stuff. But for the paper records, every so often we would just basically make a gigantic, they have these boxes that are kind of paper friendly size. And we
Mm-hmm.
pour a bunch of stuff in there and literally hand it to the archive people. And I don't know how they do their jobs. They literally look through it all and sort it out and figure out where it should go and how to store it and label it indexes, so that then they put it, it's like going to an Amazon picker warehouse, just about, just boxes and boxes on
Well, kind
you
of in
know
reverse, though.
shelves. What?
Kind of in reverse, though, because normally you get the order and the stuff's picked and you assemble it. In this case, you're disassembling it and figure
Story.
out where all it should go.
Yes. So then when I make an open records request to something that's already been sent off to archives,
Mm-hmm.
I understand if they need a week.
Sure.
They have to contact archives. Archives has to try to look it up. First, they got to figure out where it might be, and then they have to literally open boxes and start digging, because
Yeah.
they might get the aisle number, they might get the row number, they might even get the bin or box, but they certainly, I mean, it's physical rummaging through stuff trying to find the item I'm looking for.
And there's always a good chance that a newbie unpacked it and just put it in the entirely wrong place.
Exactly. And so anyway, it's a staff time nightmare to try to find stuff, but such is life. And I appreciate those people doing that stuff, because, people don't really think about it, but in the digital age, right, if your hard drive goes out, then what do you have? I mean, you can really find yourself in trouble. Well, think about, before we store everything on digital, we say there's public records, there's public documents, and they'll always be accessible, but how are they accessible? They're only
Right.
accessible if we know where they are and keep up with all this stuff.
Is there any effort to digitize those? Is there any appetite to digitize those?
There is constantly a digitization effort, but if you can imagine the tomes of papers
Sure.
that are out there, it's obvious it's a prioritization thing.
Sure. Absolutely.
So much. And then I also know, and as another example,
And it's a money thing too.
well, exactly. I mean, to pay somebody there and just literally put, in the scanner. We have people that just put things in scanners. We get interns to come in, and we don't even pay to help put things through scanners. There have been several efforts to try to move filing cabinets into digital, so that we can actually eliminate land space, because we're paying leases on buildings to store file cabinets of stuff that nobody
Right.
can in anyway. But I mean, just think about, it's like quicksand just about, I think. But bless the people's hearts who are actually making some progress on it. And as we go along, hopefully, I would love to just get an army of interns to just really put the pedal to the metal on some of these things, Sometimes, though, there's not necessarily an appetite for that. And sometimes, you need to have a staff supervisor to even coordinate all of that. So then you're taking away from their time. If they've just had a budget cut, they're not looking to add more work. It's just every reason why things aren't getting done as quickly as we'd like. And I'm
Right.
not,
So,
everybody's working at 100% efficiency. Certainly they're not. But, there are some that are working at 150. So,
so I want to get to the goodies. What kinds of goodies can we get? What can we get with these?
Oh my. Well, so contracts are a good, exciting one, although they're also kind of boring if you don't know what you're looking for. But piecing together, you've heard those news breaks that are like, so-and-so's brother-in-law was the this of the that company, and they got this contract, and then it flowed through. So that kind of stuff, you have to really kind of know what you're looking for, though. It's not one of these things you're just going to pick up and grab. So, for example, I physically saw this new tracking system in the front door. And I said, where did that come from? And so what I did was, okay, figure out how can I get information on this? Who is in charge of facilities? Who is in charge of security? I asked all those entities. And some of it was more successful than others. Finally did land on something, though, and it boils down to, there was an email and somebody said, we should do something. And somebody else said, okay, what do you want to do? And they said, well, this is what I want to do. Okay. Red flag number one, when you have an idea of what you're looking for, then you have to put it out for bid, and then you have to select. And I didn't see a full process of exactly what I would expect to see. When it comes to just we have a problem, let's find a solution, who can provide a solution. I'm sorry, $5,000 for an iPad? Or something to that? I mean, really? I don't know what this thing was hooked into, but it was really something else. So those type of things, they're juicy, but they're like one thing at a time. And you really have to know that it was there, or have a reason why you're looking. Because if you just look at the program review committee, for example, they review all these programs, or the contract review committee, they review all these contracts. There's so much there, it's just hitting you like a fire hose as far as the quantity of information that's going on. Unless you have some personal knowledge or background information that you can compare it to, it won't make any sense. And that's how so much stuff gets away with, because there aren't people out there that just kind of know the history on all these different companies and who these shareholders are without looking it up, right?
Right. Well, because there's a lot of actions by the governor this year that people disagree with. Can you get into things like, hey, this rule about couples not going in store together? Where's your scientific information on that? What informed that? Can you do stuff like that?
Yes, if the agency makes a final decision, this is another item that is in the Open Records Act. I know we started down our list and then we didn't finish. If an agency makes a final decision, then that is an open record. If an agency is writing scratch notes on a sticky pad and then they throw the whole idea out the water, out the door, then they don't have to disclose that. If it's a stupid idea, they don't have to disclose they had a stupid idea. But if they end up,
I would be in real trouble if I had to disclose all my stupid ideas.
Yes. Yeah. So if they end up doing the stupid idea, then they do need to disclose it if it's asked for. So what it basically amounts to is he made a final decision. How did he make that decision?
Right.
Leading pieces were that contributed to the final decision are open and subject to the Open Records Act under that part of it.
See, that excites me because, to me, there was the overreaction to begin with, but, I can kind of understand people panicking under the circumstance. But then what really drove me nuts is we knew that there was this 10 to 14 day between cause and effect. If you follow what I'm saying. So if
right, it was the delay. They said you won't have symptoms for 2 weeks. Right.
So when you're changing policy, and you're
You can't.
changing policy like 6 times in 2 weeks. To me, you're just stabbing like a blind frickin' monkey. So I want to know what informed these decisions. It's like, this doesn't make any sense unless you have more information, and I don't know where it came from. And a lot of these things, it's like, well, it kind of makes common sense, but common sense often doesn't hold water. You have absolutely no empirical evidence that a lot of these decisions are sound at all. So a lot of these decisions, I'm very curious as to where the heck they came from.
Yeah, that's something that you could get. Any decision that's actually made, you can kind of dig backwards and say, okay, now what were the leading factors? Did the Department of Public Health, send over a memo that said we have this research? I mean, there's all those type of different pieces that could have played into those type of decisions.
Great. How do I do that? Christy, Matt, Todd, take notes or something. How do I do that?
Okay, so each cabinet or office has a specific process for open records. Although there's one statewide process, generally each agency can determine exactly the specifics, and they have regulations that spell out each one. If they don't have a regulation, then it falls under one general regulation.
Okay.
What it is. You make the request. You don't even have to make it in writing necessarily, according to the law, but the law does allow agencies to require it in writing. So I always just do it in writing. A lot of cabinets on their websites, which every cabinet, it's like ky.gov. So it's like, chfs.ky.gov or finance.ky.gov, whatever. They all have usually a link on their website that says, if you want to make an open records request, click here. Some agencies actually provide a form that you can fill out. Sometimes it's just literally, send an email. Some agencies, because the law had been unclear for a little while, had a little heartache about email, and they were still on the old fax machine thing. But I think the law now at least does include email. It's just a matter of getting the request in. And the reason I, of course, do it in writing is so we got a date stamp on it. We know when the time starts tolling. Of course, you could always call someone and say, I want to get a copy of this. And if they need to get in writing, essentially they want to get your name, your address, and your phone number or your email address so they can get a hold of you or send it to you or however you want it, find out when it's ready. That's basically, and then it says, please describe with particularity the type of thing you're looking for. Here are the critical things you need to know about the Open Records Act. Open records does not mean run an interview on a government agency.
Right.
As you're not necessarily able to just ask any old question because they may or may not have a record that goes to that. Open records mean the existing records you can see, but they're not going to sit here and make new records for you. Like, can you give us a report of all the times when Andy Bashir said the word blank in his 5 o'clock review? Well, that would take new staff time and resources to create new information. Nobody was calculating that. However, if the communications office was keeping a tally on how many times he said the word blank, you could ask for a copy of their existing tally, right?
That makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Yes.
What else?
So you have to think in terms of what the government would be housing to know how to make your request. So some agencies, obviously, again, we're back to, are the public servants more about the public or about the whatever else they're about? As long as they're helping you and working with you, they will say, well, we don't have a record about that. I've literally had a good experience where, the lady said, we don't have that exactly in a record, but I can at least give you the information from another record if that would help. And so once I had that record, it kind of gave me a direction that gave me a clue on how the records worked, where I could actually make requests for other records based off of the information I had received. In fact, she was actually nice enough to make me a spreadsheet about all the records because it was just too many.
Very nice.
That was not required at all. But those type of things, you have to think about what records the government is going to have. Forms, memos, letters, communications, anything that's archivable like that is stuff that they actually have currently existing in records. If it takes a personal interview, you can call somebody and start asking all the right questions to try to dig into it. Eventually, your goal is to figure out where the record is and what that record looks like so that you know where to go to ask for it. And if you don't know where to go to ask for it, but it's a record that could be gotten, by law, that agency has a duty to tell you where the record is. So if you don't know exactly where to go, just start taking a stab somewhere, and then they have to tell you where you actually need to go.
Nice. What else? What else do we need to know?
Well, and it depends on what you're looking for records on. But as I mentioned, if you don't get the records, let's say within 3 days, and or a response that gives a legitimate excuse for reason why they can't give them or don't have to or whatever, at the end of all that, if you end up kind of getting cut short, the Attorney General's office is the one that addresses appeals. So let's go back to last year. There was a group trying to get records about, kind of like you were talking about. There was a communication that went out. There was stuff going on. There were some missing pieces, and citizens were saying, wait a second, how in the world did we get from there to here? There's got to be records on this. So they did an open records request. And it ended up pulling in about 200 some pages worth of stuff. Well, the agency said your records request has 200 some pages of stuff, but it's not subject to Open Records Act, therefore you can't see any of it. Well, the group said, are you serious? That doesn't even sound right. So they go to the Attorney General. Attorney General is the one who decides up or down on if the agency is compliant or not. So if the agency, which this happened, the Attorney General said, are you kidding me? All this stuff, there were a few actual exceptions, but for the mass majority of it was subject to open records. And they said, you have to show this to them. Because if the Attorney General has to get involved, the agency has to show the Attorney General the stuff that they have that they don't want to give. And the Attorney General can look at it so that he can determine, so it's like a second opinion on whether that stuff legitimately is exempt or not. And so he said all the stuff needs to go to them. So they had to give it to him. Of course, that ended up in now, and I haven't looked at this, but I have read there was a media article, I think, several months back, and I'm curious to see how this all lands, where the agency actually sued the people who made the request. I'm not exactly sure why. I guess for making a request. I need to look into how that happened. That's out of control. But
yeah.
But anyway, just so that you know, the Attorney General a lot of times can't do something about an agency because the law is not clear enough right now, I don't believe, to say what happens. Let's say they respond to you in 5 days versus 3.
Mm.
Law doesn't say what to do. It just says, thou shalt do it in 3 days.
All right. So you hear that, folks? We need to get some of my down ballot libertarians in Frankfurt with Adrienne, and they can work together to shore up that law to make it more enforceable.
Well, we definitely
one who agrees with it.
Yeah, exactly. We need, and there are a lot of people. This is a very transpartisan issue. Having
Yes.
transparency in government, because unfortunately, even if it's your same party and you can't figure out what's going on, it's no better than when it's another party. But regardless, every time you have a new term, there's going to be somebody that's not going to get the information they deserve, because
Right.
public servants forget that they serve the public, and they start hoarding information like it's their own, and it's not theirs, it's the public's.
And it sounds like we pretty much always want an attorney general that's at least somewhat at odds with the current administration.
Well, you know, the way that the Attorney General has operated, and you've seen it in the past, and it is a check and a balance. And so the reason they are elected separately is so that there are eyes on these systems and how they work. You know, whether it's what you want to call friendly or unfriendly. I mean, to me, if you're the Attorney General and you're doing your job, you have your eyes out based on the law, not based on who's friends with who or who went to law school together, or, you know, those kind of things. To me, that's got no place in public service.
Right.
To say we should all be, you know, civil and courteous with each other. But as far as, you know, doing your duty, the law is the one that sets that, and that's what we would need to be following.
Right.
You know, political things get involved, and somehow you end up sometimes covering for somebody else when you shouldn't be, or, you know, trying to rile them up maybe when it's over the top, or, there's just everything on the spectrum at this point.
Right. You need to be a pro and serve the people.
That's right. If you really want to serve the people, and there are several state employees who work their hearts out, try to do their absolute best, know what they're talking about, and try to help people. There are those people, and we've all talked to the others who maybe don't and try to hide information. If I ask a question and I say, do you have X, Y, and Z information? You could pretty much come up with a literal interpretation of that and say, I do not have said information. Or you could say, this is what I kind of did when I was in an office answering people's questions. Well, I don't believe we have that information, but I tell you what, it seems like that would be this, that, here, there. We could maybe call this person. Let's check in on that. They could give us some intel, and then we can take that over to here. Start like just troubleshooting. It's not enough to just say, turn your computer off and then turn it back on, and hopefully that helps. Goodbye, hang up. You say, turn it on, turn it off. Either if that doesn't work, call me back, or I'm going to stay on the line with you to see if that works, because that's the most basic, but it may not be the answer. Those kind of just basic customer service is what it amounts to.
Sure. Well, if you feel like the person asking for information about the government's your enemy, it's telling something about you, not what they're requesting.
Well, and that goes back to the intent of the law. So another feature of the Open Records Act says specifically, black and white, this may cause embarrassment to public officials, but we don't care.
That's right.
Yeah. But the thing is, what enforcement is there? Because the Attorney General doesn't really have an enforcement on, if the public official felt like it was too embarrassing and they tried to cover it up. But now, as the Attorney General doesn't have anything that he can actually do to sort of dig out that person or that agency and say, why were you trying to cover that up? You can't do that.
Seriously?
Here's what happens if you try to do that. I mean, so the law says stuff. You have to be a good, upstanding person to actually make sure it happens.
Huh. Yeah, we need to fix that. I mean,
right. I think we just need a little more teeth in the enforcement, and
yeah,
better.
Yeah, I mean, sir, we seem to have teeth in all the laws that impact the people who aren't in Frankfurt. Let's put some teeth in the laws that impact the people who are in Frankfurt, right?
That's exactly right.
Cool. Does anybody out there have any questions? Questions, comments, anything? I see we have something from Jacob Clark, who's just saying we definitely need Adrienne in Senate 7 and more people like her all over. We demand transparency and accountability in government. Absolutely. Thank you, Jacob. All right. Adrienne, thank you so much for joining us and for educating us. I had fun. If you, I hope you don't mind if I contact you again if I come up with something similar, because I know you could inform us of a lot. Likewise, if you have something you just want to get out, give me a ping. Great.
Well, thanks for having me, because obviously, this is something we can't have enough of. People with their eyes on government, to me, is the number one problem. There's not enough people with their eyes out there.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I'll see if we can find some people excited about that. Often people just don't realize things are an option. So maybe some of my libertarian brothers and sisters will go, yeah, why aren't we doing this, and dive in, hopefully. Monday.
The more people, the better.
Yes. Monday, we're talking with Joshua Gilpin from out Western Kentucky. And he's just talking about, I should have kept better notes, but he's going to talk to us about essentially just freedom, just, liberty and freedom, his perspective on that, having grew up where he did with his set of life experiences. So not as detailed as Adrienne's, probably not as technically educational, but it's always good to get different perspectives. Adrienne, thank you again. Thanks everybody who joined, and I hope to see you again Monday.
Thank you.